Hey, welcome again to the second of four Civic Lab Housing Series workshops. Today is all about getting to missing middle, strategies within our local government control to advance infill housing. So this workshop today will showcase existing and missing middle housing types in our region, discuss why they may not be feasible now, and we'll emphasize barriers to infill housing with practical solutions that you can take to local governments. Then we're going to hear from the planning team at the City of Portland, who just concluded a 5-year process to adopt their residential infill project, or RIP, which creates more housing choices, establishes clear and fair rules for narrow lot development, and requires smaller houses that better fit existing neighborhoods. This is our agenda for today on the screen. You noticed last workshop, we didn't have time for open discussion, but if we do at the end of the workshop today, we'll make time for that. And then Alex or Jamin, if one of you want to share your screen while I'm doing your intros, that would be great. So I'm really excited to introduce Cascadia Partners this morning for our first presentation. Alex Steinberger is a partner with Cascadia Partners. He's an urban planner and economist with strong foundation in GIS. Experience in scenario planning and transit-oriented development allows him to fulfill a broad range of project needs, from urban design to redevelopment analysis. Alex holds a Master of Urban and Regional Planning from Portland State. In his spare time, he enjoys backpacking, baking, traveling, curing meat, and spending time on, in, and around water of all kinds. So we got that from the website. Perhaps you'll have questions for Alex about curing meat, because that's not something I've ever read in a bio before.
It's a great pandemic activity. I can help you out. Let me know.
And then with him is Jamin Kimmel, Senior Associate with Cascadia Partners, urban planner with experience in a diverse range of projects and disciplines. His work included affordable housing plans, transit-oriented development, comprehensive plans, commercial district revitalization, urban design, development permitting, and development code updates. Jamin's recent projects have focused on planning and code initiatives to shape a more equitable and affordable housing market. Jamin holds a Master of Urban and Regional Planning from Portland State and is a graduate of the University of Colorado at Boulder. Spare time, he enjoys volunteering at a local nonprofit housing organization and exploring the Northwest with his family. So we're really excited for them both, and whenever you're ready, take it away.
I think Jamin's going to drive.
Yeah, now I might be able to share my screen. It wasn't letting me while you were also sharing, so. Okay. See.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. It's somewhat mortifying to hear someone read that in its entirety, but I appreciate it. My name is Alex Steinberger, and I'm a partner with Cascadia Partners. We are a land use planning, economics, and real estate development consulting firm based in Portland. But we work all over the country, and we've done a fair amount of work in the SACOG region and throughout Northern California. And in addition, you might be interested to know that I grew up in Davis, California. So anytime I get a chance to do work in your region, I get very excited, and we were very excited to get the invitation to speak to you today. So what are we talking about today? First, we're going to kind of start off slow and get on the same page about what missing middle actually is. We're going to talk about where it exists, where it doesn't, and why. And then we'll cover some of the benefits of middle housing. And then Jamin's going to come in and drop some knowledge from his experience working on middle housing code updates throughout the country. So that'll be step 4 there. So what is middle housing? Often we attach the word missing to middle housing, but we like to just drop the missing because, aspirationally, we don't want it to be missing anymore. So when we talk about middle housing, it's this idea that there's a space between the single family home and more of a mid-rise mixed use building of housing types that we don't see all that often anymore. And this is a great variety of housing types, anything from an ADU all the way up to a multiplex or a live-work building. And I'm sure many of you have seen this graphic before, done by Opticos. I think we're required to say that. But it's a good illustration of just the range of building types that are captured by this middle housing terminology. So it's a very diverse range of building types, but they do share some aspects in common. So first, they tend to be smaller units. They have higher per square foot costs, but because of their size, they tend to come to market at a cheaper level than typical ownership product. They also have less parking than other housing types, more detached housing types. And we'll talk about why that is. They tend to be ground related, which means that your front door is directly accessible to you without having to go through a shared hallway or mezzanine or use an elevator. They integrate private and shared open space. So because of the configurations of these types of developments, there are lots of opportunities for shared greens or courtyards, even small backyards. They tend to have detached or common walls. There isn't really a rule of thumb there. And because of the number of units that tend to exist in these projects, they tend to fly under the radar of large institutional developers. It tends to be more something that a local or small developer would undertake. And this isn't something that, you know, is a Portland thing. It's not a Seattle thing. It's not even just a Sacramento thing. Middle housing exists all over your region. It didn't take us very long to comb through Google Street View and find some good examples. And you can see here the range of what we would consider middle housing. Everything from your family room over the garage example here in Folsom to stack flats in Sacramento and side-by-side duplexes in Woodland. So there's lots of this out here, and we've actually done some mapping of where we think middle housing exists throughout the SACOG region. So where does it exist? Where doesn't it exist? And why? Well, this map shows that though there is a strong clustering around Sacramento, which we would expect, there's middle housing in every part of your region. Every one of the counties has at least a little bit of middle housing. And much of it was built before the Second World War, but a good amount of it has been built in recent years, you know, usually looking more like a duplex, kind of not as much variety as we used to see when missing middle was in its heyday. And we looked specifically at Sacramento and overlaid middle housing today with historic streetcar lines. And you see a really interesting pattern start to emerge here. Because middle housing was the workers' housing, right? It was the housing that was attainable for people who were kind of workaday folks. When these streetcar lines were built, middle housing tended to pop up around the stations. It was the TOD of its day. And you can really see that pattern emerging here in this map to the right. This map, by the way, is from about 1925. But streetcars continued to operate in Sacramento until the 40s. And we can look at this in other places in the region as well. And there, you can really see that there is a specific period of time when middle housing tended to be built. The map on the left is color-coded by the general era when housing was built. So the teal colors represent pre-war. And as you get more into the purple and pink end of the spectrum, that's more modern contemporary housing. And you can see on the right, we've highlighted 2 to 8 unit structures in Woodland. And you can see there's a strong relationship between those areas of Woodland where housing was built pre-war and where those 2 to 8 unit structures tend to exist. Similarly, in Winters, you see the same thing going on. You know, around downtown Winters, there's a clustering of a few of these projects from pre-war days that exist in these areas that had a little boom for whatever reason during that period. So why is that the case? Why did middle housing all of a sudden go missing after the Second World War? There are lots of reasons that factor into this, but one of the most important ones to understand is that before the Second World War and during the Great Depression, there was very little federal government involvement in home ownership. But after the Second World War, we started to change things up and make home ownership look a lot like it does today. In the 1930s, most mortgages were not fixed rate, and there were really no 20 and 30-year mortgages. They were 5 to 7 years at most. So it was a very volatile instrument for encouraging home ownership. But after the Second World War, the federal government decided that home ownership was really the ticket to the middle class for folks. And so that's when the mortgage interest tax deduction was invented that we have today. That's when the federally backed 30-year mortgage, fixed rate mortgage, was created. And it was at the expense of these other housing types, because middle housing at that time, it was a rental product primarily. And these incentives were not going to small developers, they were going to individual home buyers. So it really elevated the single family home above middle housing and caused that to be kind of the primary form of housing growth during that period. It was also a time when we really started to fall in love with our automobiles, right? Everybody wanted that 2-car garage. And that's really at odds with most middle housing. There just isn't space for that kind of parking configuration. And finally, we cemented all of these policies and programs into our zoning. Much of the zone changes that happened in the 50s excluded middle housing from certain parts of our cities and made single family housing the only type that was possible. And this has strong linkages to some of the things you may have heard in the last Civic Lab series, where we talked about redlining and racist covenants. Zoning was the way that we institutionalized that, along with our lending practices, excluding those who didn't have the means to buy into single family home ownership from certain parts of our cities. So just one example of this, and Jamin will show you a lot more of the barriers that we have either willingly and wittingly or unwittingly included in our code, keep middle housing from getting built. So this example here is from Portland. This is a fourplex on a 7,500 square foot lot. And as you can see, it's got plenty of space for landscaping, parking. It's a very pleasant building. It's typically what people hold up as the ideal of neighborhood character. It's a beautiful structure. But the irony is that in places like Laramie, Wyoming, where we've done some work, the changes they made to their code in the 1950s require much more land for a 4-unit structure. So in Laramie, you need 16,500 square feet of lot area to build a fourplex. And if you take the fourplex we saw in Portland and plop it down on that lot, it looks kind of absurd, right? It's like 2/3 of the lot get dedicated to open space. So this creates 2 problems for developers of middle housing. First, it requires them to buy a lot of land, which makes the development of middle housing less feasible. And it also requires them to find that much land, which in a lot of our communities, finding 3 or 4 contiguous lots that are available for development and land assembly, that's really rare. So it really constrains your universe of infill locations for middle housing if you have a code like this. And this is not uncommon. We see this in communities we work in across the West. And Jamin, as I mentioned, is gonna open up the doors to the litany of other things that have been put in the path of developing middle housing. So what are the benefits of middle housing? Well, there are a lot, and a lot of them really help us as planners with a lot of our goals, right? Like especially SB 375 and the goals contained in that. We found that middle housing tends to have lower VMT or produce lower VMT than typical detached housing. It tends to use less water, and it tends to use less energy. This analysis here is from a little quick run we did in Urban Footprint in Davis to see if this idea held true, and it tends to. The other elements of this are that because these are smaller projects and there's more variety in housing types, you can bring in new sustainable building technologies more easily because you're not doing them at scale. And because of all of the shared and private open space, there are a lot more opportunities for stormwater management. In addition to being sustainable, it's also fiscally responsible. This is probably a story that you all know pretty well at this point, but sometimes the upfront tax benefit of a suburban subdivision can look really good compared to a smaller middle housing project. But if you take that benefit and put it on a per acre basis, middle housing often outperforms a suburban subdivision by an order of magnitude. And it also implies that the cost of service for these units in middle housing are going to be less than in a suburban subdivision, because you have to serve that entire community with roads, sewer, power. That all implies operations and maintenance costs into the future. So these more compact housing forms are more fiscally beneficial for communities. In addition to that, it's also more affordable. We talked about this before, but though the cost per square foot for middle housing tends to be higher, because the units are smaller, they come to market at price points that often haven't been seen in a region for 10 years. You can build a cottage cluster development and sell each unit for $250,000, which for an ownership product is pretty unheard of in most places, especially in California. This is a little less tangible, but middle housing is attractive. It's Instagrammable. Because of the variety of housing types possible in middle housing and its ability to be really sensitive to its surroundings, people tend to really like it. These things tend to sell very well, and they tend to add to the character of a community rather than a large imposing building or a rather impersonal suburban subdivision. And finally, this is definitely anecdotal, but very current. Middle housing is COVID friendly. It's a little tongue in cheek, but I think this is really true because of the open space that's often incorporated into these communities and the kind of, eyes on the street dynamics that they include. They tend to foster more social interaction at safe distances and give people opportunities to go outside and enjoy the outdoors rather than being cooped up in a small apartment. So for this current moment that we're in, I think this is a housing type that's really, really important and helpful for folks. So with that, we've gained a little bit of insight into the history and anatomy of middle housing. And now Jamin's gonna show you what it looks like in the trenches of actually trying to get these housing types built.
Great, thanks, Dunny. So again, my name is Jamin Kimmel, and I am an associate here with Fiscally Partners, and I've been doing some middle housing related code audits and updates here in Oregon and across primarily the Mountain West and some other communities over the last few years, and just excited to share what we learned so far about what's working, and kind of give you some pointers in some best practices and guidelines for how you might think about a kind of middle housing code update project. So I'm laying out here in this presentation kind of 6 steps to a middle housing friendly code. The word steps and it being only 6 is a bit tongue in cheek because as you probably know, doing any type of code update is challenging, and something where you're dealing with standards that relate to predominantly single-family neighborhoods. It's not only technically challenging, but it's politically challenging. So I want to recognize that off the bat, that these are difficult projects. But what I hope to do today is to give you some ideas to help you get you started, have some inspiration for some approaches that might work for your community, and some ways to kind of work around some of those sticky issues. So I'm focusing both on the code solution itself, so some regulatory approaches, but also kind of the process for doing a code update and some of the things we find useful for bringing your community along and your policymakers along in understanding how to make middle housing work in your community. So the first step that we like to take, and we showed an example of this in the presentation today, is to highlight where middle housing already exists in your community. So we'd encourage you to do this as you're kicking off a code update project, is to highlight those existing middle housing types that are already there. Although this is an example from Laramie, Wyoming, and you know, you can see there's duplexes, there is triplexes, there's fourplexes, there's a even kind of what's probably more of a mid-rise apartment building. All of these in predominantly single-family neighborhoods in Laramie, Wyoming. And although the design of some of these and perhaps the maintenance may leave something to be desired, there certainly is, people can learn a lot about the overall scale and just basic size of these buildings. These are smaller. These can fit in with and be compatible with the scale of a single family home in a lot of cases. So pointing that out where it already exists in your communities can be really, really useful to start to think about how you integrate it in more places and allow it in a wider area, or maybe re-legalize it where it used to be permitted. Another component of that is looking at your typical block and lot patterns. And we like to do this just to kind of set the stage for a code update and begin to focus more on the basic kind of physical ingredients of your neighborhoods. So a little bit try to focus more on what is a typical size of a lot, of a block? Are there alleys serving your typical residential block? And think more about it in terms of its physical basic kind of form patterns, and a little bit less focus on the idea or more of the concept that this is a single family neighborhood, which is kind of a, and when you think about it, more of an abstract idea than it is about the kind of concrete kind of form of the buildings. And so we try to point to kind of here's what a typical lot looks like, here's what a typical house or building looks like, and have that be the stage upon which then you can start to talk about how do you integrate middle housing into a neighborhood like this. And another way to do that is to take a closer look at your existing lot sizes. So we like to do this kind of histogram of lot sizes to show the distribution and kind of where are some of the most common lot sizes, kind of what percentage of lots fit into different categories of sizes. And this is helpful because one, it's often surprising just kind of how much lot sizes vary. So the minimum lot size in the zone might be 5,000 square feet or 7,000 square feet, but the zone itself might contain many, many lots which don't conform with that are smaller. It might contain a lot of lots in one category that you may not have expected or a certain size. So this is helpful to start when you start to think about what's an appropriate minimum lot size for each middle housing type. You having this information is really useful to think about. If we apply that minimum lot size, kind of what percentage of lots would be eligible for building that middle housing type, and what does that say for the how widely it might be feasible to develop the middle housing. We'll come back to that in a little bit here. Another thing is helpful to focus on is the basic form of the buildings and a little bit of their architecture. This often is pretty well correlated with the era it was built. So this is an example from the city of Beaverton where they classified all of their neighborhoods by kind of development era. So before 1964, 1965 to 1984, 1985 to 2004. And prior to going in and doing a middle housing code update, they kind of took stock of what are typical buildings look like in this, in each of these eras, focusing more on things like what's the basic roof pitch and proportions of the windows and sizes of the garage. And these are things that can help you then to tailor those middle housing code standards to better fit into your various neighborhoods. And an important thing that this might point out is that often you have zoning districts which overlap and maybe are not contiguous with these kind of pattern areas. So in adopting a new middle housing code, you might need to think about adjusting your base zoning districts to allow you to vary and respond to different development patterns in different places, or other approaches that allow you to kind of respond more to context where your current zoning code might not allow that. So then the next thing to do is to really just take an inventory of what your code currently allows and what are the typical standards that apply to middle housing. And codes are not usually presented in a manner that's kind of useful for analysis or presentation of information. They're legal documents, they are long, they are full of a lot of what could be extraneous information. And so just distilling down key things like where are different housing types allowed, this can just be really useful to start to educate your community and your policymakers. And also I'd say don't be constrained by your existing definitions of housing types. So typical code will define single family, perhaps duplex, and then maybe perhaps townhomes, and then multifamily. Typically doesn't include cottage cluster as a separate housing type. It's kind of folded into a different one of those. Triplexes or fourplexes are usually defined as multifamily or not defined separately. So kind of break those categories up and show how those various middle housing types are not permitted or are permitted in certain zones. And this can start to really illustrate just how few areas your code may currently permit middle housing. And this applies to development standards as well. And again, being able to compare various development standards across zones is helpful. So finding a way to illustrate those in a kind of visual manner that a lot of people can engage with and start to understand is helpful. And then shifting into, now that you've had kind of taken inventory of your code, what we try to do often is to daylight what are some of the barriers to middle housing and make sure people can really understand why it's not being built or why the code needs to be updated to make it easier to build middle housing. And so a common kind of misperception we find is that the community looks at the zoning map and maybe thinks that there are, let's say you have 5 or 6 different residential zones. So this is an example in Lander where they have, I think, 5 different residential zones. But when you boil that down to where is single family allowed and where is multifamily allowed, there's one zone where any project with more than 4 units on one lot is allowed. And so what looks like a fairly kind of diverse array of zones, when you classify it by housing type, you can really see how only middle housing types, many of which would fit into that multifamily category, will only be permitted on 12% of the land. I think this is important to show for not just the percentage of the land, but also the location of the land and kind of are those places where the market is likely to want to build middle housing types? And is there a mismatch between where middle housing is allowed and where it would be most likely in demand? And then taking that a step further, another thing we often do is to map how minimum lot sizes constrain where it's possible to build middle housing. So Steiny touched on this quickly, that the minimum lot sizes often constrain the number of lots where it's possible to build. And so mapping that and showing just how many lots actually where it is, how many lots actually are eligible to meet the minimum lot size standard that would apply to a middle housing can be really useful. So this is an example from Lander. So that same map where you saw the multifamily zones is the R5 zone. If you took the minimum lot size for a 12-unit apartment building, which is almost an acre, that only 7% of the lots would be eligible for that. And much of that land is in some locations, it's kind of on the edge of town, that it's not going to be super attractive to build. It's far from amenities, it's not walkable, and it also is more expensive to serve within the structure. So you can see how it might not be very attractive to try to build a 12-plex in Lander because of this. Here's another example of doing that. So kind of taking all of the land in the R2 zone. This is in Laramie, Wyoming. And okay, let's look at which lots are eligible for a duplex, which the minimum lot size is 9,500 square feet. You can start to see how that whittles down. And then which lots are eligible for a fourplex, and it's just 0.2% of all lots. And a lot of the land is actually concentrated over on the west side of town here, which is on the other side of the interstate. It's far away from the University of Wyoming, where a lot of the housing demand is. It's a lot far away from downtown. And so showing this really helps the community understand that although the zone allows a fourplex, there's just not many places where it's likely to get built. Here's another way of illustrating that, taking it back to the lot size distribution. So this is a way of showing how middle housing types, again, how few lots they are able to be built on. So, and where perhaps no housing types are not able to be built on because of the minimum lot size requirements. So just another way to visualize that data and kind of, again, daylight that barrier. Steiny mentioned this is another barrier that the minimum lot size often requires either you to find one contiguous large lot that's already available, or to assemble multiple small lots. And understanding just how many lots would you need to assemble typically to build a middle housing type is often compelling, and it helps people to really understand why this is such a barrier. You know, getting five different property owners to sell all within a reasonable time frame for a price that allows your project to still pencil is going to be very, very difficult, and most developers will just not pursue a project if it requires assembling more than one lot. So then max density, which is closely related to minimum lot size. And the point here with maximum density in middle housing is that it's really a poor measure of scale and compatibility. So here's an example of a duplex. This is in Portland, next to a single family house. They are almost identical in size and lot coverage. But as you can see, the density of the duplex, because it has 2 units on the same size lot, is over twice that of the single family house. So density is a good measure for things like impacts on infrastructure and transportation, but often it's used as kind of a catch-all measure for compatibility of various housing types and aesthetic compatibility or scale of the building, and density is just not a good measure for that at this scale of smaller housing types. And so, as we'll talk about, focus more on the actual scale of the building and less on the number of units, because the number of units in the building the units can either be 500 square feet or 2,000 square feet. So there's a lot of difference in how big that building is. This is another way to illustrate that. This is a image from Opticos. Again, if you break that down from same lot size, same building size, and the density on this, whether you have it's that same building as one house or divided into 8 units, ranges from 7 to 55 dwelling units per acre. And so just think about how wide that range is, and your typical zone that allows up to 55 dwelling units per acre is probably your highest density zone for many cities. So interesting to think about that. That again, density is often used as a measure for the scale of development, but it is not good on it's not a precise measure for that. And density is also closely related to financial affordability and the feasibility of development. So this is from an analysis we did for the city of Milwaukee for their cottage cluster code. And this illustrated that if just going from allowing 4 units on the same size lot to allowing 5 units, the achievable sale price of those units drops to $231,000. So you could price those units at $230,000 and still make that project pencil, versus the minimum you'd need to sell the units for at, if there was only 4 units on the same lot, it's $330,000. This is another example of those financial impacts from a rental perspective. Reducing this is in Lander, Wyoming, and you have a 6-plex or a 4-plex is currently allowed on a 15,000 square foot lot. If you allow a 6-plex on a 7,500 square foot lot, it reduces the achievable rents by about 20%. And you can take this a step further by also addressing parking as a barrier. So parking is a significant cost to the development. For middle housing, the financial cost of parking is often not as important as the space cost. So you can see here that same development, if you reduced your parking requirements to 0.5 spaces per unit, you'd knock a little bit more off of the potential sale price, or excuse me, potential rent of the units, but it doesn't have quite as a drastic effect as reducing the minimum lot size. But the space impacts are what I think are really important to think about for middle housing. And a good way to think about this is just how much space it actually takes up to accommodate a surface parking space. And so this is a graphic that goes to illustrate that. For one space, you need about 200 square feet for the actual, storage of the car, and then 200 square feet to access that, and for the access and circulation areas. So this is an example with a 4-story building, but if you took that 400 square feet and assumed that was taking up land where 4 stories of building could have been built on, that's 1,600 square feet of floor area. So that's 3 housing units. So the space impacts of parking really add up. And for middle housing, this is particularly important where in areas where you don't have alley access. So if you have to have a front-loaded lot, and you're trying to fit in middle housing on that lot, one of the big challenges is going to be just getting access to the parking. Often the parking needs to be in the rear for good reasons from an urban design perspective. What that results in is less usable yard space. You lose an on-street parking space by making that curb cut. And if the parking requirements are high enough, you probably have to reduce the size of the building to make room for all that parking and access area, and that can then make the project less attractive or even less financially feasible because of the size of the units you need to restrict, or you have to reduce the number of units. Another way that a common barrier is setback requirements and open space requirements. And these are usually not as key of an issue on their own as parking and density are. but you kind of want to be aware of how they accumulate. So this is kind of again, a tongue-in-cheek graphically put together for the cottage cluster study in Milwaukee, and it shows how if you took a typical 6,000 square foot lot, which cottage cluster housing would be allowed on under their zoning, but then you added up all of the open space and setback requirements, and parking requirements, all you'd have left is space for the front porch of the building. And so this was a good way to illustrate how all of those setback and open space requirements add up, and to just be aware of how they add up and how that might impact feasibility. So then shifting to kind of best practices and recommendations. So we generally recommend focus more on the form of the building and less on density or lot size, and more directly regulate the scale of the building and allow density to increase is generally the approach that works for middle housing. So what this means is kind of allowing a duplex, a triplex, a fourplex on the same size lot or similar size lot as single family, but controlling for the size of that building. So you're allowing more units, but effectively requiring the units to be smaller in order to meet the code and be approved. And really going smaller is one of the only tricks in the developer's toolbox for making units more affordable. Construction costs are fixed, land costs are somewhat fixed. Reducing the size of the unit is one of the only ways that that developers can make units more affordable. So there are a variety of different ways you can control bulk and scale, and some of these you might already use in other sections of your code. One of them is floor area ratio. This is from the city of Portland. I know they're presenting next, so I won't talk much about this, but this is how they addressed middle housing compatibility by allowing developments on the same size lot, middle housing on the same size lot, controlling the overall floor area as a percentage of the lot. That's what the floor area ratio is. Another way to do that is you could also directly regulate the width or depth of the building. So we currently regulate building height, but we don't typically regulate the kind of width or depth. And this becomes more important as you get middle housing types like townhomes or side-by-side triplexes, fourplexes. They can become quite a bit wider than your typical single-family home and seem kind of out of proportion. So a maximum building width is a kind of direct way to address that. And similar with maximum building depth, which can also happen with middle housing types. When you're talking about cottage cluster housing, another way to control for bulk and scale is to limit the size of the cottages themselves. So this is similar to many of those other approaches. So same idea is to allow more of the cottages, more housing on the same lot, but control the size of the housing. And for those so inclined to get even more detailed with it, there is many other ways to kind of address the kind of distribution of the mass on the site, and a bulk plane is another way to do that. So this is an example from the city of Denver, where they use the bulk plane concept to control massing quite extensively in their code. A fairly simple way to address it too is to write your height standards so you are encouraging kind of house scale buildings. And so the typical way to do this would be to allow for, if it's a flat roof building, allow it to be up to 25 feet, but if it's a pitched roof, then allow it to the peak of the pitch to go up to 35 feet. So therefore, if it's you're kind of allowing your 2.5-story building if it's has a pitched roof, but again, that pitched roof helps it fit in better with the single-family housing. So now thinking about design standards. So just because we're removing barriers to middle housing development does not mean that we're kind of not regulating design or aesthetics at all, and or that's not important. And so we still want to focus on good urban form and good pedestrian-oriented design. And so, middle housing can look quite different. These are two examples of two different townhomes. I think one of the primary issues with middle housing is often where the parking is and how it's accessed. So particularly for townhomes or for plexes, requiring the parking to be in the rear or access from a shared driveway, or even just having tandem driveways rather than each of these having individual driveways. Those are all really very important. There's a whole suite of different design standards that might apply, but I think focusing as much as possible on pedestrian-oriented, good urban design, a little bit less on the particular style is the way to regulate design without it becoming a barrier or kind of an uncertainty for developers. And another way to do this is to, as much as possible, shift your code from kind of subjective or discretionary design guidelines into more clear and objective standards. And I know there's a push to do this statewide in California, and we have similar efforts here statewide in Oregon. But the rationale behind this is just really important to understand, is that objective standards provide more predictability, less uncertainty about approval or the cost of approval for developers, and that can make a big difference in kind of whether developers are willing to take on the risk. And lastly, even though a design standard may be objective, it doesn't mean necessarily that it has to be prescriptive or overly limiting. So you can allow multiple options for how you can achieve a design goal, but have those standards written in an objective way so the developer can feel confident that if they incorporate, for example, like in this example, at least 4 of the following elements, then they will be approved. So allows for some flexibility, but some certainty on the side of the jurisdiction that you're going to get some high quality design. So lastly, in parking, for maximum kind of feasibility and affordability, it's ideal not to require parking for middle housing. We recognize, though, that that's not always possible. And so this is a kind of a chart we put together to illustrate where we think kind of the spectrum of how much parking becomes a barrier for various middle housing types. So it really depends on the type, and it depends on the location, the size of the lot, whether it's alley access or not. But here's kind of an example here. So green is no barrier at all. Red is more of a barrier. As you can see, there's for some types, such as a duplex, requiring up to 1.5 spaces per unit, may not be too much of a barrier. When you're talking about something like a triplex or fourplex or a multiplex building or a cottage cluster, that becomes more of a problem. And if you are requiring parking, a way to reduce it being a barrier is to provide multiple paths to reduce parking requirements. So the most straightforward way that we like to recommend is to allow on-street parking that's adjacent to the site to count towards your off-street requirements. So that graphic on the right shows how that can work and how it effectively provides a little opportunity for more density on corner lots because you have more street frontage for parking. But there are a variety of other ways to do this. You can be based on proximity to transit in exchange for affordable units, a fee and loop system, shared parking, off-site parking, an incentive for bike parking or more bike parking than would typically be required under the code. So lots of different ways to customize that. You probably already apply this in many areas of your code, but it's important to think about how would it apply to middle housing and how can it be structured so that it reduces barriers to infill of middle housing. So this is a summer up slide. I won't spend too much time here so we can get to some questions, but focus more on form, less on density. Think about design standards that are predictable yet flexible, and prioritize housing for people over parking is really the key kind of element.
Great.
Right,
Well,
I think we're gonna open up for questions, yeah.
Yeah, thank you both. Really appreciate your good conversation. So initial question, can you speak to suburban environments, right? Specifically, we had a question about suburban environment who doesn't have alleys, a lot of their parcels front roadways, which do not have parking. So what do you do about parking in a suburban environment like that? So that's a specific question, but more broadly, how do you see this working in suburban environments? Can you talk about some of the communities, like Laramie, which are smaller examples where these types of practices aren't just for our urban core?
Right. So in terms of parking in the suburban environment, I think if the only option is for it to be front loaded and you don't have on-street parking, then you're really talking more about development types that you can either fit in surface parking or a garage. And surface parking really probably works better for things like cottage clusters, which might also be appropriate for suburban kind of environment. Or townhomes with front-loaded garages can work. You just want to think about design standards for those garages. So think about things like limiting the overall width or size of the garage, maybe requiring it to be recessed behind the main facade. So some ways to kind of integrate it well. It's still in the spirit of kind of pedestrian-oriented design, but to allow that parking to be front accessed, for townhomes.
And that came
and
up
then more broadly,
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Sonny.
I was just going to say that came up a lot in our work in Milwaukee, Oregon, which is in a lot of ways similar in context to a lot of the smaller communities in the Sacramento region. It's kind of a first-ring suburb of Portland, and a lot of the development patterns are reflective of, that 1960s, 1970s loop and lollipop cul-de-sac configuration. And what we found is that a lot of the lots are irregularly shaped. They're not square, right? And a lot of times the way that code standards are conceived is for a square lot. And so being really cognizant of how open space stacks up and limits the buildable area on a lot is really important. And as Jamin mentioned, some of those strategies for screening parking from the road and integrating it into more of a cottage cluster and looking for those opportunities makes a lot of sense in a suburban context.
Great, thanks. And you've talked about Laramie a few times in the presentation, and that's a small suburban community as well. So there are examples where this type of code change works, in the non-urban core.
Sure.
Another question. So when you're thinking about these types of changes, should you start this type of reform neighborhood by neighborhood or citywide? Do you approach it from that citywide comprehensive full approach with your policymakers, or is it best, easier, more efficient to do neighborhood by neighborhood?
That's a tough question. I'm not, in my experience, it has typically been, the code update has been was preceded by a community discussion about housing affordability. And that was a community-wide discussion. And so linking middle housing to affordability is very important. And I think that often helps people to really understand the motivation of the city. We're looking for different ways to build more housing that's more affordable. And so with that in mind, I think a citywide process can really make a lot of sense, because if you're going neighborhood by neighborhood, it's hard to hold up the argument that you're trying to promote affordability if you're only applying it to kind of a small area at a time. And so there are advantages to going neighborhood by neighborhood. You can do a little more in-depth, kind of tailoring of the standards. You can do maybe more in-depth community outreach. So, I think you can go either direction, but I think if possible, thinking about it on a citywide scale and kind of making sure you also have a consistent approach to all your various kind of areas across the city can make a lot of sense.
And just from an efficiency perspective, if you're trying to make your code more clear and objective, starting to vary it neighborhood by neighborhood and having to institute overlays and things like that to deal with that sort of complexity, that can create problems too. So if not citywide, certainly identifying zone districts that you want to address would be, I think, a minimum of how it should be done. Otherwise, it just gets inefficient and complicated. And one other thing that we didn't talk about that we did in Milwaukee is we actually recruited, I think, 5 or 6 property owners to work with us to do more in-depth study of their properties. And that really allows you to dig into some of the unique conditions that exist within the neighborhood and deal with those conditions as if you were trying to develop that property.
Yeah, that's a great point. Alex, thanks for bringing that up. Is that something you would recommend as, what's the first step? You talked at the beginning, about getting to know your neighborhood. Do you think that's an important thing for policymakers to see that middle housing actually does exist in a lot of the communities, and then getting samples of property owners to really explore that further? Do you think that's a good, first step in this process when really we local planners are not necessarily the policymakers? So how do you showcase to policymakers we should start pursuing this?
I think that's critical because it can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. Every community is a little bit different. And so as a useful first step, understanding the age of structures and the types of buildings that exist, that you can't get around that step. And also, in the Oregon context, we now have a statewide mandate that requires us to implement middle housing code updates. And that's a difficult proposition for a lot of communities. Some communities find that to be intrusive. And so one way to soften the blow, so to speak, is to make it context sensitive and really do it in a way that respects the community character of whatever community you're working in.
So we have one last question for you, but I want to make sure that all the listeners know we will make these slides and contact information to Alex and Jamin available. So if you want to continue the conversation with them, they're willing to do that. Or if you have other questions for us, please continue to type them into the chat. So how do you address utilities and infrastructure limitations when you add significant density? Master plans for sewer and water based on original densities, assumed in general plans of agencies from years and years ago. How do you just add considerably more density when you take into consideration infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the nature of these projects typically is that they're quite small, and there may be some site level infrastructure upgrades that have to be made. And that's certainly part of the added cost of doing middle housing infill. But for larger site contexts or even greenfield development contexts, that's a larger issue that may require some outside funding mechanisms. Like, in California, you don't have TIF, but you have enhanced infrastructure financing districts and things like that. But that would go for any type of development that's not middle housing specific. Jamin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and this is something that that we're grappling with now in Oregon, and with these other projects that I talked about, that each of those also did include some level of infrastructure analysis. Obviously it started with involving public works and your city engineer, and giving them some realistic expectations for the amount of middle housing you can actually expect to develop. So I think just because you allow maximum densities, that theoretically, if that was developed on every lot, would be very high. If you kind of look at it on an overall area perspective and assume a certain rate of redevelopment and infill, the actual kind of incremental increase in density may not be as great as you kind of maybe envision by such a wide zoning update. But it's definitely an issue that if you're looking at a citywide update, needs to be considered and addressed. And in Oregon, one of the ways they're dealing with that is they're allowing cities to delay updating their middle housing code until they do infrastructure studies, if they can demonstrate that there is an infrastructure capacity issue. And so in some places, this will be a challenge. In other places, integrating middle housing may not cause infrastructure issues. So it's just, again, a little bit more study and kind of targeting to certain areas where it's more likely to cause capacity issues.
Great, thanks. Well, really want to thank you for your time today, Alex and Jamin. This is really insightful information. Again, we'll make your information available to all of our local staff. So thank you again, appreciate your time. And we're excited to move on now to another Portland presentation. Sandra Wood is a supervising planner at the City of Portland's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. She, as a manager of the Bureau's Code Development Studio, she's an expert in implementation tools and the city's legislative process. She's managed more than 15 projects to amend Portland's zoning code and has worked in both long-range and career planning since 1995. She holds degrees in urban planning and political science from Virginia Tech. I'm gonna share my screen quickly. Okay, Sandra, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Adrienne, very much. And thank you all for having me a little bit. I don't, gosh, I'm almost like, do I have anything to add to that great presentation that was right before me? Because these colleagues obviously know Portland, so it's good. I think some of the slides that I have will be a little redundant, so I'll try to go through them quickly. I think this meeting ends at noon, so let's get started. So as Adrienne said, my name is Sandra Wood, and I'm the manager of the code development team. We just finished a 5-year-long project called the Residential Infill Project. It was not supposed to be 5 years, as many of you can probably relate. We tend to try to do our projects in an 18-month phase. We feel like that's the amount of time that we all have attention span for, especially the public. And this one took a lot longer for a variety of reasons. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share with you the context of what started the project, and then an overview of the project. Context of what is happening in Portland, and then an overview of the project itself. My understanding is that you wanted to hear the ins and outs of how the project changed over time. So I'll share with you the staff's proposal, and then how it changed at the Planning and Sustainability Commission. They changed it drastically, and then when we got to council, it didn't change very much. So, but there was a big difference between what staff proposed to the commission. So I'll be going through that. Next. Like many cities along the West Coast, we are trying to address our housing crisis. We've been in a state of housing emergency for probably 3 years now. It expires in March of next year. And so we've been trying a bunch of different approaches to addressing our housing crisis. As most of you know, zoning is just one piece of the puzzle. There are many other tools that cities have to address housing, and especially the homelessness issue. So we have homeownership programs, homeless programs, renter protections, local funding, inclusionary housing, tax exemptions, etc. And then in our department, we work on the zoning code specifically, and we have several projects. Next, please. Portland also has a few bonds that we've been relying on to build more affordable housing. The Portland Housing Bond was passed by voters, when was it passed? In 2016, to the tune of $258 million. And we are trying to build 1,300 units with that. We're almost at the end of that bond period. I think we've built 1,400 units with that. Metro, our regional government, also has a housing bond, and that's at $653 million for the region. We instituted an affordable housing construction excise tax that is placed on all development that happens. And we're also really interested in naturally occurring affordable housing, and we're doing some creative things through zoning for preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing and allowing them to transfer densities off of those sites so that we don't lose apartment buildings that are in good shape but are along, for example, light rail corridors that we expect to have some redevelopment for. Next, please. As was mentioned previously, we have a long history of accessory dwelling units. I think we were probably first in the nation with that. We've had them on the books for about 25 years with different programs. We're pretty liberal with them, but we only allow one accessory dwelling unit per house right now. With this project, we're changing that. Recently, the state of Oregon has allowed us to require inclusionary housing, and we have done that. So basically, any unit over, any building over 20 units needs to provide some affordable units at either 15% of the units have to be affordable at 80% MFI, or 10% of the units affordable at 60% MFI. There's also a fee in lieu opportunity for that too. Another project that we did recently, and I don't know if we got inspiration from a different city for this, but it was new to us, is that we have manufactured dwelling parks. And when we looked at how many we had, we were a little surprised about how many. And also, of course, they are much more affordable than our regular housing stock. So we recently downzoned them from multi-dwelling zone to a lower zone, capping the FAR and allowing the property owners to transfer the FAR off of their sites as a means to preserve those affordable units. Next, please. So this starts to get into how we went about rewriting our zoning code. We finished our comprehensive plan. It just actually got acknowledged by the state last week, finally. But in the midst, an update to a comprehensive plan. We've only had one comprehensive plan. It was done in 1980, and now this is a kind of once in a generation opportunity to update it. And we finished updating it in 2018, and it went into effect. And then we set about rewriting our zoning standards, and you're familiar with this. I'll give credit to Opticos Design for this graphic, and we started with the high mid-rise on the far right in a project called the Mixed Use Zoning Project, and then followed with a project called Better Housing by Design, which allows for all of the missing middle structure types. And on the far left was the residential infill project, which focused on the single dwelling zones to cover the full missing middle. I heard the conversation about maybe not calling it missing middle. The way we justify that in our head of calling it missing is that it is missing from our modern building typologies, and it's missing from our zoning code too. Primarily, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. You're familiar with this. So let's go ahead and move on. Next. Primarily because of how much single dwelling zoning we have in the city of Portland. If you're not familiar with Portland, we are right on the border with the state of Washington, which is to the north of us, and one of our suburbs is the city of Vancouver, Washington. And that's the Columbia River along the north, and the other river coming through downtown Portland is called the Willamette River. That's the green and gray. We have a lot of industrial land. All of that gray is industrial land that's along our rivers. Portland, of course, being a port city. But for the purposes of this conversation, what's most important to see here is that the single dwelling, the zones that allow for residential uses are in these three colors, the yellow, blue, and red. The single dwelling zones cover 43% of the city's land area, which is substantial. The city of Beaverton, for those who aren't familiar, is just to the west. So some of those maps that you were looking at earlier is just to the west of the city of Portland. They would be very single dwelling also. Multi-dwelling zone only covers 8% of the city. So while we allow for all of the middle housing types in the multi-dwelling zones, there's just not that much land devoted to that zone. And then the mixed use zones, of course, are in the centers and corridors, mainly in downtown and in, along some of our main streets that Portland is so well known for. Next, please. This project has garnered a lot of attention, not just because of where it ended up, but throughout the project timeline, we did a lot of public involvement, and I don't need to get into this, except I do want to mention that we sent notice to 135,000 property owners in the city. Those were all the single dwelling property owners because of our proposal for reducing the scale of housing. Next, please, which I will get into. And there was just a lot of public awareness nationally and certainly locally. It has garnered a lot of attention. Next. So let's get into the project itself. There's 5 things you should know. First, it's not going into effect until August of 2021. And those are the zoning code amendments. It's not the policy. I think Minneapolis adopted a policy first and didn't get to their zoning. I'm not actually sure if they're adopted their zoning yet. So our zoning isn't going into effect in until August of next year for a variety of reasons. We did rewrite a complete overhaul of our single dwelling zones. So those, most of the areas that are yellow in the map, there are some areas that we still need to get to. The third thing is that where we landed was to allow 4 units on almost all lots, and 6 units on any lot with a deeper affordability requirement, which we don't really expect the private market to provide, but we do expect and hope that nonprofit and affordable housing providers will use that provision. The 5th is that we introduced a sliding Florida area ratio scale to regulate size. So this is new to the single dwelling zones. We've used that Florida area ratio for commercial buildings forever, but it was new to do for single dwelling houses or fourplexes or smaller unit sizes. This is definitely something to consider, I think, really carefully. Our implementing bureau, the Bureau of Development Services, and the planners who will have to measure houses are not too thrilled about this, to be honest. Next. And then we have a few more details that you might want to know about. We aren't requiring parking for any of our single dwelling zones. And if there's an alley, we're requiring access off of that alley. The height currently is measured from the high point on the site. We switched that to the low point on the site. We, over the years, have done several projects for skinny lots, which we mean lots that are narrower than 25 feet wide. And we had 3 different standards, and that was proving to have different outcomes and regulatory confusion. So we consolidated those into one set of standards. We have provided many more incentives for home preservation. There's a lot of enthusiasm about home conversions. And then the conversions from 1 to several units. And then finally, the visitability requirement. That might be a new word to some people. It's not a full-on ADA requirement of accessibility. It's that somebody who is in a wheelchair would be able to visit the unit, not necessarily live there, but visit there. So that means a wide ramp, a wide or a no-grade entry, a wider door, a living space or a space to hang out on the main floor, and a bathroom on the main floor with a radius in the bathroom. So whenever somebody is building 3 or more units, we're kicking in the visibility requirements. Turns out the state of Oregon, who is the one who writes the building code for Oregon jurisdictions, they had a visibility requirement already in the building code. It just wasn't applied anywhere. So we're piggybacking on that. Next, please. So why did the project start? So it was 2015. way back when, and Barack Obama was still president. No one, of course, was talking about a pandemic, but in Portland, a lot of people were talking about the epidemic of demolitions. And what was happening, as you can see in the picture on the far left, there were small bungalows throughout the city, and many neighborhoods have small structures. Developers were buying up a small, less expensive house, demolishing it, and building a really large house. And everyone kept saying they're maxing out the development potential. And this is an epidemic. Another thing that was happening is that the recession had finished, and so housing costs were increasing dramatically. And we were in the midst of rewriting our comprehensive plan that had many goals that are shown in this wheel on the far right. And as you might imagine, as the previous presenters described, fitting neighborhood context was one of them. And because the project, I think, was really pushed on by homeowners in these neighborhoods, fitting neighborhood context was kind of one of the biggest goals at the outset of the project that was looming the largest. But as we went through the process, became smaller and smaller and smaller. And I'll describe that in the coming slides. Next, please. So these next slides, I'm going to present what staff proposed. So it's different than where the Planning Commission landed, like I mentioned before. The first thing that we proposed was to solve that compatibility issue, and we did it with the Florida area ratio. One thing that we did, we took what would be the Florida area ratio of what we translated our current development standards into what the Florida area ratio was. So our current development standards were setback, front, rear and side setbacks and building height. And when we took that from a 5,000 square foot lot, we were shocked to find out that a house could be built up to 6,750 square feet on a 5,000 square foot lot, given those development standards. So that's the house on the far right. That's called current code maximum. It turns out nobody was building that big. Most builders were building, I think the biggest house was at 4,500 square feet, but they loomed so large compared to the typical bungalow that's on the far left of 1,500 square feet that we all, walking by, thought that the 4,500 square feet must have been maxing out. It turns out they could have been building something a lot larger. So this was a big aha moment. Actually, there it is. The second house from the right is 4,720 square feet. I guess that's the largest that was built in 2017. It got a little larger than the 2015 one. So the first thing we did was establish a maximum scale, and this was to be for all lots, regardless of how many units were in there. So our premise was establish the box and then figure out how many units can go into that box. It's a 0.5 FAR for our most prevalent zone, which is the R5 zone of 5,000 square foot lots. Next, please. The next piece was to provide a small increase in the number of units allowed in those boxes. So we just upped everything by 1. So a house could have 2 ADUs instead of 1. A duplex, which was normally only allowed on the corners, would be allowed on all lots. And then we would allow duplexes with a detached accessory dwelling unit and then triplexes on the corner. So instead of just duplexes on the corner, we were upping it to triplexes on the corner. So we upped everything just a little. Next, please. Then the next question was, okay, where would these units be allowed? And we took a very planning approach, which was we were going through the comprehensive plan. Our growth scenario and strategy was to grow mostly in the central city and along centers and corridors, and only have 20% of our growth in the residential neighborhoods in the yellow areas. So we took that a step further and said, okay, if 20% of our growth is going into this area, how about we concentrate it near transit mainly? And we did quarter mile from transit, and we got the map that shows all of the yellow. And then we started thinking about what about the areas that are close to transit but still have low low opportunity, and vulnerable populations. And we pulled those areas out, and those are the blue areas on the map. What else do I need to say? So this was our first attempt of doing a displacement analysis and worrying about really the people that are in those areas. So we excluded the areas, like I said, that were close to transit, but had overall lower neighborhood opportunity and higher displacement vulnerability. And we measured vulnerability based on the work of Dr. Lisa Bates, which was populations that had higher percentage of renters, people of color, education, and income. And so we pulled those out because we were afraid and didn't have the data to know how this would affect their displacement. Next, please. So then we ran an economic feasibility analysis to understand how these changes would affect the number of units and demolitions and the average cost. And we found that about 10 additional units per year would be built in these neighborhoods over what the comprehensive plan was already allowing, but that those units would be a mix of smaller duplex and triplex units and would be a third less expensive. But we also, by getting more units on each lot and reducing the building size entitlements, fewer demolitions would occur. Next, please. So we went back to our wheel and tried to figure out, like, how do we meet our goals or not? And we hit nearly all of the marks, and we did better with some than others. I think the best way to characterize it, again, as I was describing earlier, is that we were balancing context with housing opportunities. So while we're adding housing opportunities with smaller duplex and triplex lots, there were not strong zoning incentives to do so. So the overall impact of the opportunity side was a lot less. Next, please. Then we got to the Planning Commission. And what we did with the Planning Commission is we started out with a goal setting work session. So there's many ways to measure the success of the project. And we knew that we have 11 planning commissioners, and we were afraid that they were all going to go in different directions with their own personal agenda, not personal agenda, but maybe trying to advance one goal versus another. And so we wanted to understand what they as a whole group would agree that the goals were, so that they could be working towards at least rowing in the same direction and working in that same direction. And these were the goals that they set out, and kind of their votes and they coalesced around. The first one was sharing the benefits and burdens of different types of growth. The second main category is increasing the range of units that are available and providing them in more locations. And finally, decreasing the entry fee into neighborhood housing by providing less expensive housing options. Next, please. So they took our green boxes of allowing more units, and they said, no, we want to allow more. And this sums up to basically allowing up to 4 plexes on each lot, whereas we had done 2 plexes on each lot. They went up to 4 plexes on each lot. Next, please. And then they took the scale and decided, instead of doing one size unit, one FAR, what if we increase the FAR based on the number of units? So this slide was shown in the previous presentation. A house would have a 0.5 FAR, a house and an ADU or a duplex, which has 2 units, would have a 0.6, and then 0.7 for 3 or more units. So that's how this played out. And this really turned out to be one of the biggest lessons learned, I think. It was a clever approach, because while you get more units, they continually get smaller, and then they get less expensive as you're building the structures. So we were able to hit a broader range of price points with this approach, and is another, I think, pretty much the crux of the proposal. Next, please. And then they took a look at the map, and they didn't agree with us on sticking to transit. And they said, what if we started with an everywhere map and subtracted, as opposed to what staff did, which was growing from the centers and Partially, I think they were persuaded that Portland is the center of the metro region. So from many housing advocates' perspectives, if you're living within Portland, then you're living in a much higher opportunity area because most of the jobs are either along the Columbia Corridor or in Central City. So they were persuaded by that, and they said, no, let's look at the whole city, and it should be allowed in the whole city. So what this map shows is that anything that's colored in yellow, pink, or gray is single dwelling zone. What's in yellow is the higher density single dwelling zones, if you will. And they wanted to allow in all of those areas, but only with certain exceptions for natural resources and hazards, which are shown in pink. So that's the only things that they pulled out. They also pulled out unpaved streets because we have a lot of unpaved streets in Portland, but that's codified, it's not on the map. The gray areas in the map are the lowest density single dwelling zones where the lot sizes are 10,000 to 20,000 square feet at minimums. That will be the next phase of the project that we have to do because of the state bill that I believe Alex was describing that the state of Oregon passed. So that is our next project that we'll be doing. Next, please. So that's where we kind of start with the nuts and bolts of the what we think of as planners, of infrastructure, the structure, how big, how, etc. And we start talking about the people. And in this case, we were really concerned about low-income renters in single-family structures. So the idea being that if you're a low-income renter in a single-family structure, it's possible that the owner of your structure will decide that this is the time to sell or to redevelop their property for 4 units because that's allowed and they can make a lot of money off of that. And then where are those people going to go? So while the Planning Commission changed our proposal so drastically and we needed to rewrite our whole proposal, part of our homework was to redo our displacement risk analysis, and we did we pretty much invented a model to do that because we hadn't done it to this extent before. So first we needed to look at where growth was expected and compare the growth between the default of what would happen without this project, the default comprehensive plan basically, and what would happen with the residential infill project. The analysis focused on low-income renters because these are the folks with the least say in where the house is, whether the house is redeveloped. And when they're displaced, they have the greatest difficulty finding replacement housing in the same area. We looked at the effects across the whole city, as well as specifically in areas with higher shares of vulnerable populations to assess whether the burdens and the benefits would be equitably distributed. The analysis quantified displacement probabilities over the course of the 20-year planning horizon. So what you're seeing here is the unit allocation of where more units of housing would go, and the blue basically would see less housing. The green would be kind of marginally from the green and yellow is kind of marginal change, but the bright red and orange are the areas that we were concerned with because they would get more housing growth. Next, please. And this is a similar map, but it measures the displacement that we're likely to see in those areas. So what we found is that in nearly all census tracts, and that's what those blocks are, nearly all census tract displacement was reduced. So that's in the blue. But there were 3 neighborhoods where we would see a net increase in displacement, and that's shown in the red census tracts. This localized increase represents a total of 75 households over a 20-year period. So that's about 4 households per year displaced. Not a large number, but it wasn't nothing either. And the Planning Commission sort of didn't know what to do with these numbers and what we were to make of it. It's important to note that the map is only reflecting the net change between the default course of action and the proposal. that means that there is displacement is reduced overall. Displacement is still occurring in all areas of the city. So while the project represents an improvement over the status quo to the tune of 30% citywide, more intervention beyond just zoning, of course, is clearly needed. And this spun off a new project for us called the Anti-Displacement Task Force Project, which is just getting underway now. Because of course, some people are being displaced possibly by zoning, but other people are displaced by new stores and revitalization, while others are displaced through speculation from capital improvement projects, etc. So we wanted to have a more consolidated effort on how we engage with those communities. Next, please. So when we looked at the Planning Commission's recommendation, how did the economic feasibility, we saw upwards of 24,000 additional units possible. So they were very, very pleased by that, especially since with staff, we only saw a minor increase in the number of units with our proposal. So by doing a larger map and more units and the scaled FAR, they achieved more units, which is what they were going for. A slight increase in demolitions, but they felt that that was worth it for the number of units, and a 50% reduction in the average cost of each unit for rental. And overall, they felt really good about that outcome. Next, please. So they looked back at what their goals were and felt, like I said, really good about those outcomes. And the inside story on that is that we had 11 commissioners. We had 2 commissioners at the time stepping off. So we were really anxious to, their terms were up and we couldn't extend their terms. We were really anxious to get a vote out of the Planning and Sustainability Commission before they left. So we had just finished this displacement risk analysis and the economic analysis, and we went and presented it to them, but we really did not do a good job in telling the story of what all of those numbers meant. And like I said, they got really excited about the economic report, which was a supply side model that showed, how many people could, or how many properties could be redeveloped into a fourplex at the higher FAR. And they were excited about the 24,000 units. What that model doesn't take into account is the demand side. We're planning for 123,000 more households in our planning horizon. And that number doesn't change. That number is given to us regionally by the regional government. So if you buy into that, even if we allow for more units, it doesn't mean that we have that much more demand. So that number, with tempered by the demand, is 4,000. So the 24,000 versus the 4,000 caused a lot of confusion, and the newspaper, the Oregonian, published a report on it on a Monday right before the Tuesday vote at the Planning Commission. And actually, at that point, we were down to 9 planning commissioners, and it cost us 4 votes because they got confused and all of a sudden they didn't trust the analysis at all. So that would be one of my lessons that I'd share with you. It's like, know your numbers and give yourself more time to tell the story and why the numbers are different between an economic feasibility model and a likelihood of redevelopment model. The way I like to say it is, in Portland, we have 145,000 single family houses, and all of us could build an accessory dwelling unit, but only 5,000 of us have. So somehow 140,000 of us have not built an accessory dwelling unit. So it's feasible that we all do that, but we haven't for a variety of reasons. Next, please. And I'll keep this short. We got to City Council. They, in general, actually pretty overwhelmingly like the Planning Commission's proposal of the everywhere map, the scaled FAR, 4 units on a lot. But the Housing Advocates and Anti-Displacement Coalition came out with a strong testimony that we needed to also provide even a bigger structure type with 6 units in it if it provided a deeper affordability bonus. The council liked that idea to allow for nonprofit housing providers to be able to compete for these lots so they could build more units. So they added that to the proposal. Next, please. This is just overall the project outcomes as we see it. This project increases the access to more types of housing in all Portland neighborhoods, which gets to the exclusionary nature of the single dwelling zones. It allows more units at lower prices on each lot. It applies new limits on building scale and height, and it reduces displacement overall. Next, please. So what did we do well? I hit on some of these. One of the things we did well, I think, is keeping the conversation about the scale and the housing types together. There was a lot of political pressure for us to pull these apart. We had a mayor leaving. He wanted to deliver something. We fought long and hard to keep those two pieces of the project together because we knew they were linked. We knew they were linked for our economic analysis, which honestly, I think it's been more in recent years. We've done economic analysis for our zoning code proposals versus the past. So that was a good choice, and it turned out to be really intricate to the proposal, especially since a lot of people think of this as an upzoning, but it's also a downzoning because FAR is decreased so drastically from 6,700 square feet to 2,500 for a house. So it's an up and a down, and it's, I'm using my hands. You probably not even see my hands. Anyway, another good thing is we allowed the Planning Commission a good amount of time to really talk about the project goals so that they all coalesced around what they're trying to accomplish with this project. But what we didn't do so well is we rushed them at the end with those numbers, like I mentioned. I think we did a great job with the financial feasibility studies, the buildable lands inventory, displacement risk analysis, which most cities aren't doing, and it's very difficult to do. We, for the displacement risk analysis, we defined displacement by direct, indirect, and induced displacement, and really tried to get into which piece we were trying to measure. And there's not a formula for anything. But we're really proud of that work, but understanding numbers and telling the story out in a way that's understandable, we could improve upon that. And finally, the history of racist planning document. So there was definitely two narratives that were occurring during the conversations about this project. One narrative that we were hearing for part of the public is like single family neighborhoods are the American dream, and that's where we invest, and everybody wants a single family house with a yard and a picket fence. The other narrative was that single family zoning is racist, and the redlining, it sounds like you've all had that discussion also. And these two narratives, people were not talking to each other. During the project, we felt like we needed to daylight this, and we wrote a report called The History of Racist Planning that looks at racial covenants in Portland and how it's contributed and how wealth has continued to be concentrated in some of these single dwelling neighborhoods where the racial covenants were originally. We did that, and when we were going back to the Planning Commission with their revised proposal to say, you told us to revise it, here's your revised proposal, that's when we had the report ready. But like I said, we had two commissioners leaving, and we were like, how are we going to present this now? Like, what are they supposed to do with this piece of information? And we decided to keep that to start the council conversations instead of finishing the Planning Commission recommendations. So the report is great. It would have been wonderful to have that report at the very beginning of our work in 2015, rather than kind of in the middle, at the very end of the Planning Commission's work. They actually didn't see it with this project. We presented to them later. So the lesson here is that we really didn't lead with race or the housing crisis story. I think other cities, Seattle has done a lot better with that. They had their Hala housing affordability, livability agenda. It sounds like Sacramento has too, so that's great. Minneapolis has also. We're having a hard time getting the attention of other folks who were working in the housing arena. And to be honest, we even met with the housing anti-displacement folks in 2015, and I don't think they could see it either. Their attitude was single-family neighborhoods aren't where the folks are that we're representing. So this project isn't really a priority for us, and they were not engaging at the beginning of the project either. So I think, you know, the world changes when you have a project and that lasts so long. Another reason to do a project quicker. And obviously in 2020, the world's a completely different place, and we can all be speaking about race a lot more openly than we have in the past. So if I had to add a seventh step to the previous presenters' slideshow, I would say identify your allies. Know who they are and who they're advocating for, because I think in this new world, we need to be elevating the voices of more vulnerable populations. With this project, the most vocal voices, of course, were the single-family white homeowners who have always had access to and privilege of having access to power. Next, please. And we're almost done, because I think we're almost out of time too. Anti-displacement strategies. Out of this work also came a listing. Through this project, we're hearing all of like, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? This is our list of anti-displacement strategies that we cataloged. Not that we're doing these things. We're hoping to do these things, but I think that's something for all of us to think about and something that we want to be doing in the future. Next. And that's it. We can stop sharing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. Really appreciate your presentation and getting us within time. So that's great. Please continue to type your questions in the chat. You can do them to me privately and I'll speak them for you. You can type them openly, or you can unmute yourself and ask questions. So Sandra, I think to kick it off, one of the things you said you did well, and we were noticing throughout your presentation, is all the great analyses that you had done your displacement analysis, economic forecasting. Is that work you took on as the city? Did you have help via consultants? I think we're really interested in kind of the methodology, how you got such great analyses out of this work.
Yeah, the economic feasibility analysis, we had Jerry Johnson from Johnson Economics help us with. We do have an in-house economic development planner, and that was the person who worked with Jerry to figure out how we were going to analyze economic feasibility. So that's how we did that work. The displacement risk analysis we did entirely in-house. So we took Jerry's analysis and just started kind of playing with the data, knowing the populations, using census tract data, the populations that lived in each census tract, but we did it internally. We documented all the steps that we did for that in our displacement risk analysis report. So I can send you a link to that, Adrian, if you want. I don't know if it's definitely not perfect, but I think there's probably a lot to learn still from that. And everyone we didn't have a common understanding of what we would do with that. Like I said, 75 households over a 20-year period, averaging 4 households per unit for this project. And that's only low-income renters and single-family houses. So it's very specific. Not what about homeowners whose taxes are increasing? What about, and so it was clear because we were also doing the multi-dwelling project, and there the trade-offs were a lot clearer. Like you demolish one house and you're building 20, that seems worth the displacement of one household to have space for 20. But as the numbers go down, you're like, is it worth it for 10? Is it worth it for 5? 2? Now I'm starting to feel more and more uncomfortable, right, about the displacement of one household to make space for 2. And So some people were worried about the actual household, family that was living there and their displacement. Other people were not looking at that at all. Some commissioners were like, I'm wondering what's the affordability of the duplex or the triplex or the fourplex, and could a household like this household that has these characteristics rent one of these new units? And so I think there's a lot of thinking to be doing around that and what our policy is. Because when we say we don't want displacement, are we talking about that family, or are we talking about that category of families over time? And there's that temporal aspect too. So we have a lot to learn. I'll send you the link to the displacement risk analysis, but that was what I think the Planning Commission, all 4 votes were against the proposal because they weren't clear on what we were doing about displacement. Some were worried about homeowners that wouldn't have the opportunities to take advantage of these, to do a duplex or triplex. And even an ADU, it costs $150,000 to build an ADU. So who has that? So they didn't know what to do with that information. And several of them said, I'm just voting no to make a point. Of course, council heard that point very well and didn't want to see the project at all.
Thanks so much, Sandra, and congratulations on a pretty monumental effort. You mentioned that this was a 5-year process, which I think for many of us is a little bit intimidating. Any suggestions or lessons learned that we could learn from to help kind of accelerate that process?
One of the problems that we had was that the mayor who started the project was leaving. So I think we probably lost a year in time around that because he was leaving and he wanted to vote on this, and we weren't ready with our proposal and we didn't have enough time to take it to the Planning Commission for a recommendation. We decided, let's take it to council with a concept report. And this council can have a hearing and they can vote on the concept that will then go and codify for the Planning Commission. So that whole process took about a year, especially since they voted on it and then he leaves office and so does somebody else. And now we're down to only 3 people who were there. And then we had a new director. And then that director's like, why aren't we doing XYZ? So that whole thing, so then we had to put it back in, but the 3 people who had been there is like, wait a minute, we voted this down. Why are you bringing this to us? So that whole process was a year-long process. I think I struggle a little bit with taking something to the Planning Commission. They have never rewritten a whole report like this to the extent that they did this one. They do amendments often, but in this case, a lot of things had changed as far as the allies and the advocacy community. So I guess one of my recommendations would be get in touch with your housing advocates and know what they're going to be advocating for. Because the housing advocates and the homeowners formed a coalition during our concept development phase, and they were coalescing around certain things. And they were always pushing us to go further. They wanted the fourplexes from the get-go, but we were also hearing from so many homeowners that thought we were destroying neighborhoods that we took a middle ground. And the Planning Commission, I mean, I guess it depends on what your Planning Commission and council makeup is. I think we knew that the Planning Commission would take it further. But we thought our charge was, again, to that goal, the compatibility goal, we prioritized more than providing more housing options. As a matter of fact, they stripped out a lot of the design standards that Alex and Jamin were talking about earlier. Like we had more persnickety design standards about roof pitches and all that stuff. The Planning Commission was like, we're in a housing crisis. Why are we still prioritizing compatibility? So it wasn't necessarily that the analysis was taking us so long, even though that did. It was just different priorities. And I don't know how you find that out without talking to them, waiting their turn in the process.
Yeah, I'm happy you touched on the stakeholders because, you know, if advocates and property owners are coming to the table, I think that's important to keep in mind. So we have only 2 short minutes left. We had a question about the floor area ratio approach. Why a flat maximum? Why isn't that preferred? Why did you do the scaled approach instead of a flat floor area ratio?
I think when we did the flat floor area ratio, which is what staff proposed, it didn't yield as many housing units. It became less feasible for redevelopment to occur. So that's why it wasn't yielding as many units as I showed before. Like in staff's proposal, we weren't getting that many more units, but we were stopping the demolitions, which is what was one of our primary objectives. So that scaling allowed those structures to become bigger and the units to become larger, which also you start getting into the family size units and how many bedrooms each one of them can have, because we didn't want 4 studio apartments either. So for those 2 reasons.
Great. Well, thank you, Sandra, again for your time. We really appreciate you speaking to our group today. We're excited to share your presentation. The actual presentation and the displacement analysis would be excellent to share as well. So thank you again for your time. Just want to thank everyone for participating today. I do want to make a quick note for our next housing series, which I think will be really exciting. We're talking with the private sector, having an in-depth conversation with them. So with Julie Young, which is a small developer, we have Steve Vallejos from Prefab ADU, which is a small builder of ADUs. We have Susan Brown with Umpqua Bank. So we kind of are rounding up the spectrum with finance, builder, developer. We'll again have a local jurisdiction as well. So we're excited to have you again in 2 short weeks. We will send you this recording as well as the presentations within a few days. So thank you everyone for participating. We look forward to seeing you again in November. Thank you.